Hello, welcome to Whitney Pier. I'm Ian, and today we're talking about Elizabeth Beaton's Ethnic Identity of West Indians in Whitney Pier. And this article is about another community that tends to get overlooked in the study of Cape Breton culture. And it gets overlooked in many ways in the study even of African Nova Scotian culture. One of the first things to potentially discuss is the use of the term black. If you read the footnote, she does indeed suggest that the term of choice, even in 1985, was colored, which was thought to be, even though it was an emic term, it was still used among the community themselves. They tended, it was thought we would probably use the more pan-North American term black. Until recently, I tend to defer to the term African Nova Scotian, until, of course, I actually talked to some students of mine who were from the black community in Whitney Pier said, yeah, don't call us that. That's what they call, that's what Halifax people call themselves. We are black. And it's like, okay, all right, there we go. So in some ways the language might seem dated, but it's also actually the language that's chosen. And a lot of it has to do with the history and the heritage of the community itself. So this article, rather than be sort of a collective community history, it takes the issue of church affiliation and like the development of congregations, either the one more or less entirely black congregation that's at the African Orthodox Church, or the various affiliations that they had, that the community had throughout the various churches in Whitney Pier. So the community itself, there was a brief influx from Alabama. African American coming up, recruiting for the steel plant, and they were immediately faced with sort of Jim Crow attitudes. The management of the plant was African American, white American. Most of the plant managers at the time in the steel plant were from the States and white, and they immediately gave this group the worst jobs in the plant, and the community quickly went home. And that we face segregation back home. Why would we travel here and face the exact same thing? The bulk of Black Whitney Pier community comes from a small portion come from inside the province. A lot from Antigonish. They tracing their presence back to Loyalist times. So the Loyalists, the communities that were loyal to the crown during the American Revolution and then were exiled and expelled. So much of the Anglo communities in the Maritimes and in Ontario and in parts of Quebec are Loyalist descendants. So it's a kind of an interesting issue in terms of the rhetoric of displacement that is present in much of the settlement of the Maritimes. And but there were they came up in so let's just say 1785. They basically came up when the province of Nova Scotia, or the territory of Nova Scotia, became the more sort of complicated Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, New Brunswick. But the bulk came from the West Indies, primarily Barbados, although there were some families from Grenada as well. And that the largest group have Caribbean ancestry, West Indian ancestry, which is a different dynamic. Because one of the things that Elizabeth Beaton points out in the article is how the community was, all of Whitney Pier was basically for lack of a better word, the ethnic neighborhood. It grew up, it was deliberately adjacent to the steel plant, which finished construction in 1901, was basically here to house workers of the steel plant, but often these new communities that would emerge. Places like Ashby, downtown Sydney, the industrial neighborhoods that sprung up off of the original sort of island of Sydney, the neighborhoods that sprung up in that area, those were largely sort of Anglo-Celtic neighborhoods, Whitney Pier housed the black community, the Italian community, the Polish community, the Ukrainian community, and the Newfoundland community. The Newfoundland was sort of, it was a separate country. They weren't Canadians, and so we might have difficulty wrapping our heads around it now, but they comprised at least a national group, if not necessarily an ethnic group in the way we typically use the word ethnic. But they at the very least, they were a migrant group. So Whitney Pier was a inherently sort of multicultural neighborhood, and it intensely defines itself to this day as the multicultural neighborhood. That being said, the issue of skin color marked the community in a way that was different from from other communities. But since so many of them came from Barbados, and the rest had come from elsewhere in Canada, unlike the immigrant communities that came sort of directly from Europe, they had gone through this process of a colonial existence, which, do not get me wrong, is not necessarily a positive thing. But at the very least, it allowed for a more streamlined acculturation into the Cape Breton and particularly the Sydney context. They were English speaking. They had English schooling in Barbados. Schooling was universal, so they had a good. The black population of Barbados had access to schools and were well educated and highly literate in English, and they had business practices and so on. So they had, again, through the evils of colonialization, they nevertheless had become inured to some of the eccentricities that is life under a Anglo-Celtic hegemon, and so on that level they were able to assimilate quite well. But skin color was obviously one of the barriers because, white supremacy still exists. Now, West Indies had a long history of experience with the Maritimes. This is a bit of a tangent, but there's a kind of trade triangle that exists between Eastern Canada, the Caribbean, and Europe, and particularly England. And basically, the good crops of the Caribbean, like the good sugar, primarily the good sugars, would be sent to England. The rough sugars, the rough molasses, and so on, would be sent to Atlantic Canada for rough trade. The good cod would be sent to England. The rough salt cod would be sent to the Caribbean, and the good pine. The good ships would be sent to England, and the rough pine, the knotty pine, would be sent to the Caribbean. So you had this interesting trade triangle where we were both, in different ways, subservient populations to England and to Europe in general, and that's where the patterns of trade came and the patterns of power trade came. But then there was this interconnectedness. You ever wonder why molasses is so popular in the Maritimes? When's the last time you saw a sugarcane field on your drive to Halifax Airport? They are not particularly common, but we were getting that sugar. We were part of this trade because Atlantic Canada, since the 1750s, have always been connected through markets. I mean, prior to that, the Mi'kmaq were connected through markets well before contact. But the rapid industrialization of trade and the overseas trade and the transoceanic trade that colonialism brought meant that Cape Breton, as much as it understands itself as isolated, and as much as it wasn't necessarily in the center of power, it was always interconnected. And so there was a familiarity between the Maritimes and the Caribbean. And if you ever visit the Caribbean, there are interesting patterns that resonate between Atlantic Canada and the Caribbean, in part because of the different, albeit complementary, consequences of colonial legacy. So it's kind of interesting. So she, and basically she breaks down the various churches in the pier, and the decision to affiliate or not with these churches by the various members of the congregation. And when in doubt, when you're wondering where an article is going, it's not a bad idea to skip to the end. So, I won't go through it a little bit, but at the very end, she mentions that choices of affiliation can be reconciled. The choice to become a member of one or over another congregation can be reconciled within the understanding of the West Indian blacks' choice of strategies of individual and group survival in the reality of dominant white society. So affiliation was related to multiple ties, not simply ethnic ties, but issues of class, issues of culture, issues of profession, and issues of neighborhood, no less. Because even though Whitney Pier is small, you might just be going to the church that's most adjacent. And I like this point. I'm paraphrasing it. But personal piety and the sanctification of rites were important, but the minutiae of doctrinal distinctions less so. So while the West Indians were undoubtedly aware, and here I'm quoting, while the West Indians were undoubtedly aware of the doctrinal differentiation between the various denominations, it appears that they were largely indifferent to such factors. There's often been a sort of understanding, again, a facile historical understanding, that the legacy of slavery sort of ripped identity, because the legacy of slavery, I should say, ripped identity away. Affiliation becomes diffuse, and then patterns sort of were deconstructed and then forcibly deconstructed and then get reconstructed. And one of the things the article points out is that no, affiliations are deliberate decisions. They are intelligent choices. They are weighed measuring the pros and cons. And certainly an ethnic identity that is often thrust upon one by virtue of the outside hegemonic force, are part of those decision makings, and law and prejudice and exclusion, both as governed by regulations and just as governed by practice, can affect those. But affiliation is largely a matter of intelligent decision-making on behalf of the individual practitioners, in as much as sort of the accidents of history that then get re-entrenched by becoming family traditions. So she's clear to point out that affiliations might change over time, that they might change in part due to circumstances. They might change in part due to shifts in the employment. If someone got a promotion, they might move towards, and the black community might look askance if someone moves from one of the churches to, say, the Anglican Church, which was the most affiliated with the middle class, was the most affiliated with Sydney families and sort of old money, as it were, and but the decision was still present. So she runs through the history. It's there in the readings. I won't go into too much detail, but a lot of it did have to do with, some of it did have to do with a certain tension that was felt within the communities, but families were welcome. Sometimes they weren't necessarily either willing or able. The record isn't clear, but sometimes it's able, or allowed might be even the more accurate word, to take, say, leadership positions within the community. Some went to Holy Redeemer, and so even though they were part of the community, there was nothing that was sort of specifically black about observances, but certainly not religious, but also vernacular religious. And there was a sort of a patterns of segregation, which were similar to the patterns of unofficial segregation in Nova Scotia. This is prior to Viola Desmond and the fact that there was genuine rules of segregation, but that wouldn't have necessarily been explicitly practiced in the churches, but could have been practiced by terms of convention. There's Methodist and Presbyterian churches were initiated. They were part of the, one of the things they started was the United Mission, which actually, it started as an Italian mission and then was taken over by the United Church, and it was specifically for the black community. And the building is still around and still functions as a mission. The Methodist Church, of course, but the Methodist and Lutheran churches merged in 1925 and became the United Church. So the old Victoria Methodist Church folded over time and merged into Trinity United, which has, since the time of this writing, has also closed. Trinity United is just up the street behind me on Victoria, and Victoria being the main street that runs through Whitney Pier. There was for a while, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, an effort to start that, and that was an American black church. That seemed to be a lot of effort and initiative. There was a storefront rented for a small congregation. There was land that seemed to have been purchased, but it never really took off. In large part because it was an American African church, an American black church, and so it didn't necessarily coincide with the cultural background of the community itself, which was, as I said, largely West Indian or descendants of loyalists. And so it didn't have the long 19th century American black experience to inform its sense of self. It had its own experiences. And so the message of sort of the black Protestantism that was forged in the American 19th century just didn't seem to resonate. So it seemed too foreign, as it were, because it was sort of Southern, American Southern, and it didn't quite work. And the Anglican Church always did well, in part because, as I said, it was part of the middle class. It was the church that the West Indies would be familiar with, because the Anglican Church also extended out there. Not necessarily, not necessarily wholly directed towards its black congregations, but the black congregation would certainly be used to it. Again, inured to it by living in the shadow of colonialism. But the Anglican Church, because of its Anglicization, because of its very Britishness, it coincided. It seemed to be something that at least had that aura of familiarity. So again, there wasn't necessarily a large sort of black identity affiliated with the church, but a member of the it had members of the congregation. There was an effort to actually basically have a mission, a black Anglican church, and it did exist for a while, but basically it sort of folded in on itself after a while, and the congregation dispersed, some back to the Anglican Church, some to the United Church, and some to the African Orthodox Church. And the African Orthodox Church has its own interesting history, and it's related to the movements of Marcus Garvey, but it's independent of, and the way it was manifested here, it was doubly independent of. But it had, at its center, it had an idea of a black North American, if not necessarily independence, then at the very least self-determination. And so it had a small p political agenda. In other places, it might have been much more strident and incorporated with a return to Africa movement. Marcus Garvey was one of those initial movers that also simultaneously was coincident with the Harlem Renaissance. It was coincident with the beginning of the Nation of Islam. It was coincident with even the beginning vestiges of Rastafarianism in Jamaica, and the sort of, in the wake of colonialism, a return to Africa movement. And so it did manifest here, but again, it never, that political agenda didn't quite hit, but the church itself, with its rather sort of syncretic traditions, the way it resonated with both Catholic and Anglican and certain Orthodox, the way it incorporated West Indies imagery, the way it was, it seemed to sort of draw in a large enough matrix of symbols that it struck a chord with the Black Whitney Pier community, and it became it's the only AOC congregation in Canada. Otherwise, it's basically an American and I think parts in the Caribbean church. But the one in Whitney Pier is the only actual congregation that exists in Canada, and it was and it became basically the center of black cultural life, sometimes to the chagrin of members of the church itself. So while church affiliation might still be with the Anglican or the United or whatever, even to the 1980s when this was written, and to the present day, even though affiliation, religious affiliation, might be taken up with those congregations, cultural, ethnic affiliation is still very much associated with the AOC Church of St. Philip's. And so, if there are black activities, as it were, Caribbean activities, the entire community would go there. So their church, and particularly the church basement, functions very much like the hall does, like the way Julia de Gasperi talks about the Italian Hall in Dominion, and the way the Cedars Hall works for the Syrian and Lebanese community in Townsend. It became a cultural space. Now, literally in a basement, so you don't even have the benefit, it's like a side building. But nevertheless, that became the focus, not of religious identity per se, but of cultural identity. It's been 35 years. As I said, some of the churches have actually closed in the way that many churches in Atlantic Canada have had to close, or really dioceses have had to consolidate. So Trinity United is now shut. Congregations would have moved, with the benefit of things like motor cars and so on. Groups get bigger and bigger. The Polish church still exists. The Polish Catholic Church still exists, despite the fact that the Holy Redeemer Catholic Church is 3 blocks away, because the Polish community has a sort of critical mass of population that can sustain itself as both as a religious and an ethnic identity. The Ukrainian church is still there. It has its own rights. The African St. Philip's is still there. And St. Philip's is not a purely black congregation. There are actually white congregants there. But it's interesting. The article, in part, is a bit of a time capsule, because this is still 1985. The plant is still in existence. Outmigration hasn't hit Whitney Pier in the same way that outmigration would hit all of Cape Breton within the next 15 years. The same thing that actually drove the closing of some of the churches. It wasn't a lack of interest in maintaining community. It was a lack of community able to maintain. But I like how she ties it into place. And I like how she ties it into her the main argument is that the quote-unquote ethnic identity of Whitney Pier blacks, it's thrust upon them. It's thrust upon them because of the nature of the color of their skin, in a way that is radically different from the ethnic identity that is perhaps one can pronounce or announce in terms of one's name, but one can, quote, for lack of a better word, pass. And so because we live still, even in a reasonably chill Cape Breton, we still live in a sort of, white supremacist state. The ethnic identity is something that's thrust upon them, and they choose. It's not a passive acceptance. And like I always say, one is member of multiple groups at a time. One is member of families and communities and professions and neighborhoods and sociocultural background and ethnic background. And there isn't a one-to-one situation that demands certain orthodoxy, forgiving the pun, given St. Philip's, but demands certain orthodoxy about how one chooses. So this is an article that argues for identity being constructed, intelligently constructed, contextual. It doesn't make it any less meaningful. It just means that it is deliberate and intentional. So, thank you very much. This has been Elizabeth Beaton's Ethnic Identity of West Indians in Whitney Pier. And as ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Bye-bye.